Hey everybody, it's Monique with Made with Accuquilt, a friendly support group, and here is my video on using the clamshell. So I actually had the 4-inch clamshell and I had the 8-inch clamshell, and I wanted to start with a big one because I thought it might be easier because you are sewing curves, and so I thought bigger might be better. When I went looking for instructions on the Accuquilt website, there were no assembly instructions there, which was very disappointing. And for some reason, I can't find my packaging for my dies. I always keep my packaging if they have patterns on them or instructions, and I can't find them. So I'm wondering if they just didn't have instructions. There was a video online, so I wrote down a few notes, but it really didn't show up close how to do it. It was a little confusing. I did find this pattern on the Accuquilt website, which is for a clamshell pillow. And so I thought, well, I'll try using this and see how that goes. So it actually, I was dreading using these dies a little bit because they're curves, and there's darts and you have to match them. And I thought, oh, how is that going to go? But it actually was surprisingly fun. So come on and walk with me over here. Ignore my dirty floor because my puppy was in here yesterday and he likes to tear apart paper. And he's my personal shredder. So here is my clamshells so far. It's a little hard to see because it's a super sunny day today, but I hope you can sort of see that. So it's actually turning out to be really fun. I found this layer cake, which are 10-inch squares, and I thought those would be perfect to use to cut these. And so that's what I'm doing. And I will share some hints, what I learned. Now, they say you can pin baste these or you can glue baste these. I've been pin basting using lots and lots of pins. Glue, I just don't see that working very well because you have to put a dot of glue and then dry it with your iron and go on to the next spot. I think pinning works way better, and I am not usually a pinner. So, you can try both ways. I recommend pins, but I have not tried to glue. So anyway, we're going to take a piece of fabric here. So this is from my layer cake, and make sure that it's all nice and pressed. And we do want to make sure that we put it on our die the correct way, of course. Now there is going to be a little bit of waste of fabric when we do this because there is just no way to make this not waste fabric, basically. And so I just need to make sure that my fabric is on here the correct way. Yes, it is. So the non-stretchy side is over here. My sticker is right here. And so I want my selvage to be, on the sticker side here or here. So anyway, so I've laid that on there. And like I said, you are going to get some waste of fabric. But that's just, there is no way to avoid that. And you might be able to save a little bit of fabric if you cut your own squares that are not 10 inches, but not much. So this is basically what you're going to end up with as a waist. And I thought you could make a really cute bikini top, bra top quilt out of these if you put some fusible behind these. Because you could cut these off and it would look like a bikini top or bra top. But these are basically going to be your leftover if you use a 10-inch square. And so, like I said, if you cut your squares a little smaller, you'd be able to save a little bit of fabric here and here, but really, not that much. So I decided to just use my coordinated layer cake. All right, so I am going to run this through my machine, and I'm going to put my phone down because I can't do that with one hand. And then I will start my video up again when I am ready to pin. All right, so I have cut my clamshell here, and this is what I've already sewn. And one thing I do want to point out, that this may look kind of weird. When you start sewing your clamshells at the top here, they actually tell you to sew however many clamshells together that you want to have in your row. So I just did 3, and you just sew together the very bottom part of it, like maybe 3/4 of an inch on the whole row. So you start with that, and then you start working your way down. All right, and so these ones are unsewn at the top here. I actually tried sewing this one a little further, and that really didn't work. So you actually just want to sew 3/4 of an inch, and unfortunately there's no mark for that. I wish they had put a a dart there to kind of say, oh, just sew to here for your first row, but they didn't. So you're going to sew your first row just a little bit to keep them all in place. And to make a quilt or a pillow like I'm going to make, you actually will sew these together. You see how they're all uneven edges here, and you're actually going to be chopping all these off. And so this, again, will be wasted, everything above here. So you're basically going to keep about 1/4 inch, I'm thinking, you know, just for your seam allowance. And this is all going to get chopped off. But that's just the nature of the beast, you know, that's the way it's going to go. And I will also warn you that this is not a, you know, a project for the faint of heart, I guess. I mean, it's fun to do, but it's not fast. And you're going to have to go slowly, and you're going to have to pin lots. So if those are not your strengths, then I might recommend that you don't do this. You know, don't get this dyed, or don't work with it. So I'm going to show you how you pin. So basically, I'm ready to sew this one onto here, and I'm just going to double check that I am actually in frame. Okay, I am. And so I found that, so these darts, you basically want to have them line up with each other, but they don't actually really. This middle dart in the middle here, I like to line up with the center point of the one above it. And then these pins have been amazing. I just bought these. These are really sharp, nice and long. They have this nice rubber grip, and these have been just wonderful. I highly recommend these. So anyway, so in order to start pinning, what I did, I flipped everything over, because you are going to want to sew this, obviously, to the wrong sides together. And so I have this little dart here, and so I laid that on my seam between these two, and then I move it down so that my seam allowance actually matches up. All right, and then I pinned those, and you are going to use lots of pins. I will share a picture of a piece that I did yesterday, which looks like a porcupine because I used so many pins. So anyway, I have 2 pins in here, so this is lined up with the center of the one above it, and now I want to match this dart to this dart, and I want to match this dart to this dart. And so you can choose which way you want to go. I found at this point it's easier for me to just flip everything around, but I won't do that because I think that's going to be confusing. So do you see how I matched up my darts? Here's the dart from the one underneath, here's my one from the one I just cut. And so that's where I would put another pin. All right, and this looks like a giant mess, and you're going, where are you going with this, right? So anyway, so now you're going to work yourself around, and you want this to get matched up all the way to this point here. And so you want your seam allowance to match, or you want your raw edges to match, but don't worry about that for now. You just basically want to just line up this very point of your clam with the previous one. So I'm going to stick a pin in there so this is perfectly matched. I hope you can see that. And now I think I am going to flip it over actually. So you're going to have to do what works for you, but it's going to work better for me to flip it over. So now I have all this extra in here, and I'm going to have to ease this in. And so what I found works best is to just kind of stretch both of them, because they're both stretchy because they've been cut on a curve. And I'm trying not to poke myself on my pin over here. Let me just move this one. Move it this direction there. All right, so I have, you know, kind of a lot of fabric, it seems. So what I like to do is stretch it a little bit, and then kind of with my fingers hold it in place so that the raw edges are even. And then I like to put a pin in the middle of that section. So I now know that those raw edges are lined up, and then I can go over to this side and stretch them a little bit and put a pin in the middle of that. And then I can go over here, and I might put 2 pins in here just because it's kind of a big section. So I just pinch it with my fingers and then put a pin in there, lining up my raw edges, and then put another pin in. All right, so I've used 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pins already, and I've not even finished pinning. So here is what it looks like so far. So now I'm going to do this section here, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to pull my fabric a little bit and try and get my raw edges even. And you might have to just kind of fiddle with it. This is why I said it's not going to be a fast project, but I am enjoying it. And if you need to use more pins, use more pins. Just have lots of pins available. You hear my puppy? She's dreaming. All right, so here I have half of my clamshell pinned. So now I'm going to go on to the other half. So it's going to meet up with this dart here. And this will make more sense when you have your pieces in front of you, for sure. You know, when you're looking at mine, you might be going, what? But when you have your own pieces, it'll make more sense. And unfortunately, when you're sewing curves, it always seems really goofy until you actually sew it and then press it, and then you go, oh, okay. So I found that I had to turn my work around lots in order to pin, so that I had good view of everything, and you know, a good, so I wasn't pinning anything to anything that shouldn't be pinned. And don't be afraid to move your work around so that you have the best possibility of pinning it correctly and getting it all correct. All right, so I'm using tons of pins over here. I sure hope I am in frame on my camera. I think this one's going to need more than just one pin. So I'm kind of stretching both my fabrics and trying to figure out where the center is, and then popping a pin in there. And then I'll add some extra pins. Alright, so now I just have this section over here left. Look how many pins I've used already. Kind of crazy. Like I'm doing acupuncture on a quilt here. Alright, so I have my final section here. I'm going to pull it apart a little bit, stretch it a little bit to try and get the raw edges lined up. Okay, that looks pretty good. I'm going to put a pin in the center. Another one, and probably 2 more in here, just to make sure everything stays in place. So it's not lined up very nicely. There we go. Okay, so I now have my entire green clamshell pinned to the previous row, and there you go. There are all my pins. Kind of crazy. So I tried sewing with my new clamshell on top, so like this under my sewing machine, but I found that it was too easy to catch the other pieces underneath. So I actually had sewn some pieces to each other that shouldn't have been sewn together. So I started sewing them upside down. So the green one is my new clamshell I'm adding, and what I like to do after I pin it is just flip the whole thing over and then sew it with the new clamshell at the bottom, because I found that I could keep an easier eye on all these extra pieces that were flying around if I did it that way. And so that's going to be up to you, a little bit of trial and error, whatever you want to do. But now basically I'm going to go to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew all the way around very slowly, taking out my pins as I'm going, and I'm going to sew all the way from one end all the way around the clam, all the way to the other end. Okay, so I'm going to do that and then I'll be back. Okay, I am ready to sew my clamshell onto my other clamshell. I'm going to try and squeeze in here in front of my camera. And here is my new clamshell. It's on top. It's going to be at the bottom because I found it easier to sew that way. And so the rest of my quilt is at the top. And you see how there's a lot there. There's a lot to keep an eye on. So you want to make sure that you don't accidentally sew any of these other pieces where they shouldn't be sewn. All right, so I'm just going to try and get all my pins this direction, get all my fabric flat underneath, and as I'm sewing I do keep checking to make sure that I have nothing that shouldn't be sewn underneath my new clamshell. All right, so you're going to sew with 1/4 inch, just like you normally would. And in my previous video I said you sew your wrong sides together. That's of course incorrect. You sew your right sides together, right sides of your fabric. Okay, so I'm going to sew really slowly, and when I get to a pin I like to pull them out. If you want to sew over your pins, it's up to you, but I don't want to risk breaking a needle. And so I'm sewing very slowly around the curves, and then when I get to places where it looks like it's a little bit of a fold there, I try and straighten it out because I do not want to sew a fold into my clam. Now sewing like this, in the meanwhile, because I'm pushing things down and things are being pushed out of the way, you will wrinkle up your other clamshells. That is just going to happen. So just be prepared that you're going to be pressing your other clamshells again when you're done sewing a new clamshell on. That's at least what I found. They just got wrinkled, and so they've all been getting extra pressing the entire project. Okay, I'm just going to check underneath and make sure that I have nothing extra underneath there, just my 2 pieces of fabric. No little stragglers catching in there. And boy, I hope you're patient watching this, because, you know, I don't sew fast, and sewing curves, especially not. So you see here, I don't know if you can see that or not, but there's a little bit of extra fabric there, so I'm just gonna maneuver that out of the way. Pull my pin out. So, you know, I think I'm really enjoying sewing these clamshells, but it's not a, if you're looking for a fast project, this is not it. It might be fun to hand sew these. I haven't tried that. I might think about that. But I have other hand sewing projects I enjoy too, so I don't know. I'm not convinced I would do it, but it could be something enjoyable. So now that I'm going on to my other half of my clam, I'm just maneuvering all my extra fabric so that it's not gonna get in my way. And then I notice here that my fabric is not quite lined up. My raw edges are not quite lined up, so I can try and put another pin in there just to keep that in place. It's easier to put pins in before you start sewing than to try and put them in as it's under your sewing machine foot. So just keep that in mind. All this extra stuff. Move this one out of the way. Of course, the one thing about using big clams is that your project will go faster because you're using such big ones. And I have not used a 4-inch clamshell yet, but I have cut my pieces because I am now intrigued to find out what it's like to work with the 4-inch ones. Now that I've kind of figured out how to use the big ones, I don't think that the 4-inch ones are going to be more difficult or anything. They're just going to be, you know, a little smaller, so less pins. All right, I'm almost there. So I'm sewing all the way around the whole entire clam. The final part is a little tricky because It's hard to hold on to because it's underneath my foot, but I'll try and, sometimes it's handy to use this little purple thing to hold everything in place so that I don't sew my finger. All right. So that has been sewn. There is my previous quilt top, and here is my new one. And do you see how everything gets kind of wrinkled? Because it, of course, has been squished together. So now we're gonna go and press everything, and we're going to press towards the new clamshell. And when I first started, I thought, well, I'm gonna press away from my new clamshell, but that actually makes it look like it's underneath the other ones, which is not what you want. You actually want it to look like it's on top of the other ones. And so you are going to press towards your newest one, all right? And so I'm gonna go do that, and then I'll show you what it looks like. All right, and here I am at my ironing table, and I'm going to press towards my new clamshell that I just sewed on, towards my green one. And while I'm at it, I'm also going to press all the wrinkles out of my previous clamshells, because this is just what seems to happen. You tend to get wrinkles in the previous ones. Sometimes the wrinkles are bad enough that you need to use a little spray of water. Now, one other note I want to point out, if you're using directional fabric, there is very obviously an up and down with these clams. And so if your fabric selvage does not allow you to cut your clam facing up with your directional fabric, you'll have to choose something different, because you definitely want to have your selvage facing the right direction while going through your machine. And it'd be better to use fabric that can go whichever way, so that you can pay attention to that. All right, so there I have pressed my new clam, and then the top, probably the front, will need some pressing as well, because it just tends to get messed up. It tends to get messed up as you're sewing the new ones on, but that's okay. They're all gonna get more pressing. And I thought about using starch. I could use starch when I'm all done sewing everything together, but I didn't want to use starch while I was trying to fit my curves and get my curves to fit together, because I wanted to actually have that stretch, and starch might make it, you know, be a little bit less stretchy. So I didn't want to do that. All right, so see how perfectly these match? There's a little wrinkle in there, but that's not from sewing it together wrong. It's just from having it go under my needle and being stuck. But anyway, so there is this one now all sewn on, and now I would go on to this one and do the same thing. And for this pillow, what I'm doing, I'm sewing on these ones here, but half of them are going to get cut off when I cut them to fit my pillow. So here I'm going to do my next one here, so just 2 here, as if in this row, like in this row, and then I'll do 3 underneath this one, and I think it's going to be big enough to make a pillow, and then I'm going to trim it. Now, I was thinking about this, and I thought, what if you don't want to waste, you know, all this up on the top here? I think what you could do, if you wanted to, is you could needle turn applique the top. And I don't enjoy needle turn applique, so I would not do it this way, but I think you could actually do needle turn applique and just have a strip of fabric that you would applique this down onto if you don't want to chop it off, if you want to actually have a full clam. I think that would be an option. I am not going to try it because I don't like needle turn applique whatsoever, but I think I'd be curious to know if that would work. And so if you are a needle turn applique fan and you have this die, try it and let us know what you think. But anyway, here is my my clam shell pillow top so far. And like I said, I'm going to do this one here and then 3 more. And so what I did for these ones here, in case you're wondering, I could only sew down half, obviously, because I don't have anything else to sew it onto. And so all I did was just pin it and just do the 1/2 of this. So I used exactly the same method, except I only sewed half. And again, when you're doing this yourself, it'll make sense. When I'm telling you, you're probably going, I don't know what you're talking about. But I think when you're doing it, it'll make sense to you. Definitely these full ones are easier, and but you can do it. All right, I hope that's helpful to you.